On the show today, we'll get a better understanding of the farmer-herder violence in Nigeria. We'd like you to be part of today's conversation. You can join with the hashtag #BeyondMarket, and you can send comments to my Twitter handle too, at Esther or Awoniyi. Now, the International Crisis Group says Nigeria's farmer-herder crisis has become the country's most challenging security situation, claiming more lives and property than the insurgent group Boko Haram. My guest, Nnamdi Obasi, Nigeria's Senior Advisor, International Crisis Group, joins me from Abuja for a better understanding of this crisis. Nnamdi, thank you so much for taking the time out to join us today.
Thank you very much, Esther.
Now, this farmer-herder crisis is not something new. It's been with us for several years, but obviously things have taken a different turn this year. What we've seen, or what we used to see in the past, was spontaneous attacks, but what we see now is a more coordinated and premeditated attacks. Could you just help us understand the factors that have led to this escalation of the crisis?
Well, thank you very much. You're perfectly correct. It's been a long-running conflict over decades, but then in the last 3 or 4 years, we had seen a tendency towards escalation. And in last year, September, the International Crisis Group published a report warning that this was going to escalate if decisive actions were not taken, to curb that possibility. But then what has happened, in the last several months is a dramatic escalation of the conflict in terms of the scale of attacks, the number of casualties, the amount of displacement, the humanitarian and security impacts. Everything has gotten significantly worse in the last 6 months. Now, part of what has happened is, first, the lack of action by the government. Now, in certain cases, early warnings were given, but there was no early response. Secondly, in most cases, the perpetrators of violence have been able to go without any sanctions, and that has created a climate of impunity that has emboldened groups to undertake more actions. Now, because of that, we're having more organized kinds of attacks, larger numbers of fighters. It's no longer the spontaneous reactions to perceived provocations and grievances. It's now a case of groups organizing in significant numbers, dozens and hundreds, and attacking communities. And so the scale of the violence has also increased because of that. I think the third point that we also noted in the report is the introduction of the anti-grazing laws, especially in Benue State, but also in Taraba State. Now, whatever the spirit behind these laws, whatever the intention behind them, they have had two impacts. First of all, they have aggravated tension between herders and farmers, therefore, making relationships much more difficult, making dialogue much more difficult. And then also they have displaced herders from Benue State into Nasarawa State, into Taraba State, to Adamawa State, and in some of those states, they have now intensified the resource struggle between farmers and herders for the limited resources available. I think these are the three main factors that have driven the escalation.
Now, I've often wondered, before we got to where we are today, at that time when it was just a few skirmishes between the herdsmen and the farmers, I've often wondered what the local governments, because that's the government closest to the people at the grassroots, what the local government or the states did, because this is basically a fight over land. It's basically a battle over who owns what land and who's encroaching on whose land. So land that is still at the heart of this problem. So do you think that there was a missed opportunity for perhaps the local government and the state government to step in at that time when it would have made more impact for them to bring both parties to the table, to the dialogue table, and see how those issues could have been resolved then?
I think there has been a failure of governance at all levels, at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level. There have been, of course, missed opportunities for dialogue. But I think that there's a huge responsibility that the federal government has to bear, because it has control of the instruments of security and instruments of justice and so on. And therefore it has, overwhelming responsibility. There's a limit to what states can do. There's a limit to what local governments can do. And whatever they can do would just be short-term measures to contain disputes and tensions. In the long run, what was needed was for the federal government to have foreseen that this was going to happen. The trends have been on for years and decades, and there was a need for a policy response on a comprehensive scale towards dealing with this, and they didn't do that all these years.
Now, sometimes it's always good, and it's also mentioned in the report, and this is the approach that government has taken and continues to take, is speaking to the heads of the communities, the heads of the farmers or heads of the communities that have been attacked. How effective would you say that has been, calling the heads of the communities or the chiefs and so on, to bring them together, speak to them so that they can go back and speak to their communities, speak to the farmers, and for the herdsmen, speak to the herdsmen, the pastoralists, to bring them to the table and see how dialogue can be, the first port of call to curbing the violence?
Yes, state governments have done that, and the federal government, has of recent stepped up engagements and consultations and so on. Perhaps this should have been more effective if it was done earlier on. But certainly there's a lot of room for local engagement. There's a lot of room for local dialogue, and that has not been fully exploited. Military and security measures do have their place, but they are of limited impact as long as people at the grassroots do not have some kind of agreement about how to relate with one another. And so local dialogue is extremely important, along with the security measures being taken.
Okay, let's talk about what is being done now to curb what's going on. Part of what you've said as being part of the factors why this has escalated is the non-prosecution of past perpetrators, and the report is recommending that the federal government begin to investigate and look into those who have committed crimes against these communities or on both sides and bring them to justice. How easy do you think that's going to be at a time like this? We've had incidences from several years ago, this year, last year, 2, 3, 4 years ago. How does the government begin to look into or to investigate those kinds of crimes at a time like this?
It may never be able to arrest and prosecute all those who have been involved in violence, but that is not a reason for not doing anything. And it may not be able to prosecute all the cases over the years, but at least it has a responsibility for the cases that have happened under its watch since 2015 to investigate those cases, to apprehend the perpetrators of violence, and to prosecute them. On all sides, on both sides, herders and farmers, everyone tells us that it is that sense of injustice, that lack of redress, that is a major factor fueling reprisals and feeding a cycle of violence. And so we think that the government really has to do something about that. The scale of arrests in recent times has increased, but then we are concerned also about the process, the pace of delivering justice. We've had cases in courts that have taken 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, and that doesn't deliver any sense of justice to people who have been hurt by this violence. So we did recommend in the report that there is a need for the government to fast-track trials, and so that people can see that they get justice.
You're also recommending or advocating a quicker, swifter response to distress calls, especially in those remote areas, and the government has said that it would put out more policemen. But the report also mentions the fact that the crisis has also become a big burden for security agencies, the police, first of all, and then the army. And looking at the number of policemen that we have, for the entire country, just at the last time I looked, about 229,000 or something. And I'm thinking, do we have enough policemen to send to those remote areas at a time like this?
Again, you're quite correct. The military is overstretched. It's been involved in too many operations all over the country, too many internal security operations. The police is also overstretched because of the limited numbers, like you rightly said. But then we think that the police, even with the resources available, they can be deployed a little more efficiently. The military is involved in entirely policing operations in several southern states. They are, running around after kidnappers and after, cult gangs and so on, which we think are entirely police duties. The military could be pulled out of some of those operations and concentrated in the areas that, need the most help in the Middle Belt, in Zamfara State and the Northeast. The same applies to the police. There is still a large number of police officers who are in state capitals protecting governors, politicians, even private businessmen that ought to have been, withdrawn and deployed in some of those areas. That said, it's never going to be possible to deploy sufficiently given the wide stretch of the area involved. And that's why we think that, several measures have to be pursued: security measures, local dialogues, peace initiatives, and so on. If people continue fighting without any interest in peace, without any discussions about resolving conflicts, then of course there's a limit to what security measures can achieve. We also think that the security deployments that are on ground at the moment need to be better resourced. I was told again and again, that the units are there on ground, but in certain places they don't have the logistics, they don't have the communications, to relate and connect with each other and to be able to go respond quickly enough to distress calls. So beyond the numbers is also the logistics and communication resourcing. All that has to be improved.
Let's quickly talk about the anti-open grazing law. Now, this was, at a point, it seemed or sounded like a silver bullet. And many states, including, or especially Benue State, were quite eager to implement it, and they did eventually. But, we did see a backlash immediately that law came into place. And you're recommending that it should be, we should take a step back, take the law, put the law aside, and begin to implement it in phases. Not all the states agree to it, and I think maybe just one or two of them have done that so far. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on why this solution, at a time when it seemed like it could work, didn't work and had this very wide-reaching negative impact.
Well, let's start from the fact that grazing, open grazing, indiscriminate grazing, had become very highly conflictual way of managing livestock. Population has grown, settlements have grown, grazing routes have been blocked, and so on. So there was increasing friction, increasing tension, increasing disputes, and increasing violence between herders and farmers. So state governments, in the absence of a federal government response, had to devise their own, ways of dealing with this. And Benue State, decided to enact a law banning open or indiscriminate grazing. So the spirit behind the law is perfectly understandable. There's also the fact that, this law passed through a due process in which, people came and public hearings and so on and so forth before the state legislature prepared the bill and sent to the governor, and then he signed it. But the point we make in the report is that pastoralism is a long-standing cultural practice. It can be switched off like an electric, device. It's like saying that from next week we ban poverty. We don't want anybody to be poor again. It can't work like that. There has to be a phased approach towards, winding down gradually a certain way of doing things and encouraging people to do things in another way. And we thought that the 6 months allowed by the Benue State government is just, unrealistic. It should have had a process by which, it lays out very clearly modalities for herders to maybe form into cooperatives, given the capital requirements for setting up a ranch. Clear procedures for acquiring land, clear and realistic procedures, because some of the provisions in the law are not really realistic. It has to do work on training people in ranch management, in veterinary medicine, and so on and so forth, and providing facilities that would encourage ranching. We also recommended that the government could have pilot ranches or demonstration ranches in which it can show to people how ranching can be done, and teach the herders, and then gradually they can transit to ranching. And that's why we're in support of the federal government National Livestock Transformation Plan, which gives a 10-year period for that transformation. Okay. We think that is a bit more realistic than 6 months. Nnamdi, and that's why we recommend that the Benue State government should freeze enforcement of the law and prioritize the phased transition to ranching. Okay,
Nnamdi, we're going to have to take a quick break here. We'll come back and pick up from where we left off. I've been speaking to Nnamdi Obasi, Nigeria's Senior Advisor, International Crisis Group. We're continuing our discussion on the farmer-herder crisis in Nigeria. Still with me from our Abuja studio is Nnamdi Obasi, Nigeria's Senior Advisor, International Crisis Group. Nnamdi, thank you for your time so far. Now let's also still focusing on the solution, this time a different approach that the federal government is taking. The FG is proposing cattle colonies as a long-term solution, in addition to, as you mentioned earlier, the National Livestock Transformation Plan. This is to run between 2018, that's this year, to 2027, and it's going to cost about 179 billion naira to be spent over 10 years. What are your thoughts on this National Livestock Transformation Plan? And I've heard, mixed views on how vague it sounds. There aren't too many details on the table at the moment. But what are your thoughts?
Well, the first point is that it represents a step forward in responding to the crisis in livestock management. And we think this should have come much earlier. It's unfortunate that it has taken 3 years of the administration, to finally come up with something, comprehensively addressing the problem. Our fear again is that, it's the government is now largely engaged with the politics of 2019 elections, and we really need to stay focused on this plan to see that it takes off from the ground. It may not be a perfect plan, but it represents a real attempt to deal with this problem because it has, several components. And we think that the time frame given, 2017 to 2028, 2018 to 2027, is, realistic, in terms of dealing with a lifestyle that has existed for centuries. So we support the plan, and we also note that the major actors, herders associations and farmers associations, have endorsed the plan, and we think the government should run with it.
What would be the major difference between the cattle colonies and what we have now, the anti-open grazing law?
Well, this is part of our concern about the government, that, the policies have kept changing. First of all, the government said it was acquiring 55,000 hectares, and then it said, 11 states had offered land at that point. This was early 2017. And then later on, it went on to the cattle colonies, and then it went on to the National Livestock Transformation Master Plan. The National Livestock Transformation Master Plan appears to be a refinement of the earlier idea of cattle colonies. And it's a little more clear about what it intends to do. It's a little more precise about the components that need to be addressed. And it may not be a perfect plan, it may not be a perfect solution, but it represents a template by which the government can proceed, and it can then refine the process as time goes on.
Now, obviously, quick implementation is of the utmost importance here. We
Yes.
still haven't heard anything about that. What have you heard on the ground in terms of how fast we can get this plan on the road?
Well, we haven't heard anything about getting the implementation started, and we are really concerned about that. Part of the process of getting the implementation started is getting the buy-in from various actors, be they herders, farmers, state governments, and so on. And the government needs to intensify the advocacy, needs to intensify the engagement with all these actors to see that they are all on board and they come on the table. Second is the capital requirement for getting this plan started. And it wasn't in the 2018 budget, it's just been announced. And so the government needs to put up quickly a supplementary budget with which to start implementation. Then the third challenge is engagement, and that's the greatest area of concern. All the governors, ministers, and key people are increasingly concerned about the elections. You must have heard of the very dramatic defections from one party to the other, and there's a lot of dynamics on the ground as far as inter-party relations and intra-party politics is concerned. And all of this may draw attention away from a major policy initiative that needs to be implemented urgently. So we think that the core focus for now should be on getting buy-in from various actors, on getting the capital provisions for starting up the process. Let's
talk about the solutions being proposed by the federal government in trying to take a different approach. They've talked about cattle colonies and, of course, the National Livestock Transformation Plan. Well, I mean, what's the major difference between, for instance, the cattle colonies and the anti-open grazing law that was proposed before now?
Well, the idea of cattle colonies, as you know, was very controversial because it required all states to provide land for the establishment of ranches, and there was a whole lot of criticism of that, especially from the middle belt and the southern parts of the country, because it was seen as leading to forceful acquisition of land from areas some of which said they did not have land to provide that space for ranching. Now, the national plan is something from our point of view is, first of all, more comprehensive. It addresses all the various components of a ranching policy. It's more realistic. Secondly, it provides a longer time frame for the transition, 10 years, as we observed earlier on. And thirdly, it is starting in phases 10 states initially, although some of the states have backed out, 2 or 3 of the states have backed out, but at least it provides a starting point from which other states, can be encouraged to come in. I think it's also much more acceptable to both herders and farmers. Herders and farmers associations have expressed support for the policy and are ready to engage with the government on it. So we think that this is something that the government should run with. It should engage the various actors, elaborate on the plan, explain the provisions, address the fears of state governments, and get all actors on board, to start up. Secondly, unlike the cattle colonies, here we have a clear budget estimate for implementing this project, which means it's probably been better thought out. But again, we are concerned about that because it's not in that budget, it's not in the 2018 budget. And so there has to be a supplementary budget to start off this process. And we're really concerned about how quickly this can be started, given that there's so much interest, engagement now on politics rather than on policy. And that's the third major concern, that this policy really needs to take off and gain some momentum before the later part of the year, because as we get closer to the February 2019 elections, politicians and political leaders will be more engaged in the politics of the election rather than in governance and policy.
Now, while all of that is going on, the people themselves, the communities, and on both sides, the herdsmen and the farmers, have decided to take matters into their own hands. Your report also mentions ethnic militias that have illegally armed themselves and are carrying now these attacks and reprisal attacks. How should the government begin to approach disarming these militias and to just get both sides to, toe the path of peace while the government formalizes and strengthens its plans to put those peacekeeping plans, as it were, in place?
Yeah, first of all, is that, as we mentioned in the report, there's been more deployment of security personnel and assets in some of the most vulnerable areas. That's a significant step towards putting the militias in check. But also we mentioned the important role that intelligence has to play in, providing information about the locations and the numbers and so on of the militias, so that operations can be carried out, more pointedly towards disarming them. That involves a lot of engagement with communities in order to obtain information that is critical to, improving on the conduct of operations. But more fundamentally, our experience globally is that groups don't disarm as long as their fears are still in place. And therefore, it's necessary to get to a point in the dialogue and policy responses that groups feel their interests are being addressed, their fears are being addressed, and that makes it it makes it easier for them to give up their arms, and it also makes it easier for their communities that are protecting them to, cooperate with security agencies to collect the arms from them. So it's a whole basket of issues that need to be addressed at the same time. No single issue can be addressed in isolation.
And let's talk about the victims here. I mean, obviously there have been victims on both sides. We know that yes, thousands of villagers and communities have been displaced. We've heard of cases where marauding herdsmen come and, completely sack communities and even rename those communities. So for the people themselves who have been displaced, what can you tell us in terms of how they're being taken care of, and if there will be instances where for those whose communities or whose homes have been taken away from them, they're able to return to those places?
Well, the plight of the displaced, the plight of the people impacted by the conflict is really very unfortunate. We visited 2 of the IDP camps in Benue State, and they are really in bad conditions because they have been largely taken care of by the state emergency management agencies. And those agencies, either in Benue State or Plateau State, have very limited resources. So the people are largely left, to their own support and their own devices. A number of non-governmental organizations, faith-based groups, and others, have brought in some relief, but it's clearly not adequate.
I've been speaking to Nnamdi Obasi, Nigeria's senior advisor at the International Crisis Group.